the northwest tip of Vancouver Island, in a stretch of open Pacific Ocean where three tectonic boundaries meet in a place seismologists call a triple junction, the seafloor has been rupturing again and again over the past several weeks. On July 23rd, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake. 2 days later, a 4.4. On July 31st, a 3.9. And then, in the early morning hours of August 1st, 2026, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake tore through the same patch of ocean floor, the largest event in the sequence so far. And it wasn't a standalone quake. It was the latest entry in a swarm, a cluster of dozens of earthquakes striking the exact same location over and over within a span of just weeks. This isn't the first time this has happened here either. 2 years earlier, in July 2024, this identical stretch of seafloor produced more than a dozen earthquakes above magnitude 4 in a matter of days, and Canadian seismologists specifically flagged it as a swarm occurring at one of the most structurally complicated and seismically hazardous fault junctions on Canada's entire Pacific coast. Now it's happening again. Today we're breaking down exactly where the swarm is occurring, why this specific junction of fault systems is considered so significant by the scientists who study it, and what this renewed activity actually means for the millions of people living along British Columbia's coastline. No exaggeration, just the seismic record as Earthquakes Canada and international monitoring agencies have documented it. If you want to keep following this story as it develops, subscribe and turn on notifications because this swarm is still active. A thumbs up helps this information reach more people living along Canada's Pacific coast. Let's get into it. Let's start with exactly where this is happening, because the location itself is the key to understanding why this swarm matters so much to the scientists watching it. According to Earthquakes Canada and international seismic tracking data, the current sequence of earthquakes is centered roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Port McNeill on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, and similarly offshore from the small community of Port Alice. This isn't open, empty ocean in a geological sense. It's the specific location where the northern Juan de Fuca Ridge, the Savanco Fracture Zone, and the Nootka Fault Zone all intersect. A genuine triple junction where three distinct tectonic boundaries meet and interact with each other. When Earthquakes Canada tracked a nearly identical swarm at the same location back in July of 2024, the agency's own public notice specifically described it as a swarm of earthquakes offshore Vancouver Island, occurring at the intersection of these three specific systems. Language that reflects just how structurally unusual and seismically active this particular junction is compared to more typical stretches of fault. To understand why a triple junction like this produces so much seismic activity, it helps to understand what each of these three systems is actually doing. The Juan de Fuca Ridge is a spreading center, a location where new oceanic crust is actively being created as two tectonic plates pull apart from each other, a process that inherently generates frequent, if usually moderate, seismic activity as fresh crust forms and cracks under the stress of separation. The Savanco Fracture Zone is a transform boundary, a location where two plates are sliding horizontally past each other, similar in basic mechanism to how California's San Andreas Fault behaves, though operating entirely underwater in this case. And the Nootka Fault Zone is itself a smaller, actively deforming transform boundary that separates the Explorer Plate, one of the smallest tectonic plates on Earth, from the larger Juan de Fuca Plate immediately to its south. When you have a spreading ridge, a fracture zone, and an active fault all converging at essentially the same point in the ocean floor, you get a location where stress is being generated and released through multiple different mechanisms simultaneously, which is precisely why this junction has such a well-documented history of producing exactly this kind of earthquake swarm. Now let's look at the actual current sequence in detail, because the pattern over just the past few weeks tells its own story. According to earthquake tracking data compiled from Earthquakes Canada and international monitoring networks, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake struck at a depth of 10 kilometers on July 23rd, roughly 182 kilometers from Port McNeill. 2 days later, on July 25th, a magnitude 4.4 earthquake struck at the same 10-kilometer depth, approximately 198 kilometers from Port McNeill, essentially the same location as the previous event just 48 hours earlier. On July 31st, a magnitude 3.9 earthquake occurred at the same depth, roughly 101 kilometers from Campbell River. On Vancouver Island's eastern side, a signal the activity may have been spreading somewhat, or being detected across a broader network of monitoring stations. Then, in the early hours of August 1st, at 4:49 a.m., Coordinated Universal Time, the largest earthquake in the current sequence struck, a magnitude 5.6 event at a depth of 10 kilometers, located 199 kilometers from Port McNeill and essentially directly offshore from Port Alice. It's worth being precise about what these depth and magnitude numbers actually mean for anyone living on the coast. A depth of 10 kilometers is considered relatively shallow in earthquake science, meaning the rupture is happening reasonably close to the surface rather than deep within the Earth's crust or mantle. Combined with the fact that these earthquakes are occurring roughly 180 to 200 kilometers offshore, out in open ocean well away from Vancouver Island's populated coastline, the practical impact on coastal communities has so far been minimal to non-existent in terms of felt shaking. But shallow offshore earthquakes in this magnitude range are exactly the kind of events seismologists watch closely for a very specific reason: their potential to trigger tsunami activity, even when the immediate shaking itself isn't felt strongly on land. This is genuinely not the first time this specific stretch of seafloor has produced a notable swarm, and looking at the historical pattern helps put the current activity in context. Back on July 11th, 2024, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck at a depth of 10 kilometers, located 183 kilometers southwest of Port Alice, according to Earthquakes Canada. That earthquake was followed within hours by additional significant events: a preliminary magnitude 4.3 quake roughly 27 minutes later, a magnitude 4.9 event about an hour after that, and another preliminary magnitude 4.8 quake roughly 2 hours after the initial rupture, all clustered at essentially the same location. In the notice Earthquakes Canada issued at the time, the agency confirmed that a total of 13 separate earthquakes with a preliminary magnitude of around 4.0 or greater had been detected in British Columbia's offshore waters since the start of that July alone, all concentrated at this same triple junction location. Officials at the time were clear that no tsunami and no damage were expected from that swarm, though they noted the earthquakes might have been felt by some residents across Vancouver Island, given the size of the largest events involved. Going back even further, this specific stretch of ocean off Port Alice has a documented history of producing significant headline-generating earthquakes well before the current era of dense seismic monitoring made swarm tracking as precise as it is today. In October 2013, a magnitude 6.6 to 6.7 earthquake, depending on the specific measurement source, struck roughly 25 miles southwest of Port Alice at a depth of around 7 to 14 miles, generating no reports of damage or injuries, but registering strongly enough that more than 650 people across nearly 36 cities logged onto USGS reporting systems within just 2 hours to confirm they'd felt the shaking, with reports coming in from locations as far away as Kelowna in south-central British Columbia and suburbs of Seattle across the border in Washington state. That earthquake was followed by aftershocks measuring magnitude 5.0 and 4.2. At the time, USGS geophysicist Dale Grant noted it was the strongest earthquake in that specific area since another magnitude 6.6 event that had struck the same general location back on November 2nd, 2004. A reminder that this particular stretch of seafloor has been producing significant felt earthquakes on a recurring basis for at least the past 2 decades, and likely considerably longer given the underlying tectonic structure driving the activity. So why does a location like this matter so much in the broader context of Canada's earthquake risk, especially when compared to the fault systems that typically get the most attention? To answer that, it's worth stepping back and looking at British Columbia's overall seismic landscape, because the Nootka Fault, triple junction, doesn't operate in isolation. It sits within a broader, genuinely complex tectonic environment along Canada's Pacific coast that includes several other major fault systems, each with its own distinct hazard profile. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, running along the full length of Vancouver Island's outer coast and continuing south through Washington, Oregon, and into Northern California, is capable of producing megathrust earthquakes exceeding magnitude 9. Events that occur roughly once every 300 to 500 years according to Earthquakes, Canada's own historical analysis, with the most recent such rupture occurring in January of 1700, an event whose tsunami crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and was documented in written records in Japan. Further north, the Queen Charlotte Fault, an active strike-slip boundary that the USGS has directly compared in character to California's San Andreas Fault, extends more than 200 kilometers from offshore Vancouver Island up through the Fairweather Range of southeast Alaska, and has produced 5 separate earthquakes above magnitude 7 within just the last 100 years, including Canada's largest instrumentally recorded earthquake, the 1949 Haida-Gwaii earthquake, measured at magnitude 8. One larger than the famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and the more recent 2012 Haida-Gwaii earthquake, which reached magnitude 7.8. According to the USGS, the Queen Charlotte Fault presents the single greatest earthquake hazard to residents of both southeast Alaska and western British Columbia, among all the fault systems in the region. The Nootka Fault Zone and the Triple Junction, currently producing this swarm, sit in a genuinely distinct position within this broader picture, structurally connecting the northern end of the Cascadia Subduction Zone to the southern portions of this wider offshore fault network. It's smaller in scale than either Cascadia or the Queen Charlotte Fault individually, but its complexity, 3 separate tectonic boundary types converging in essentially the same location, makes it a location that produces earthquake activity with genuine regularity, as this current swarm and the nearly identical 2024 sequence both demonstrate. Seismologists specifically study swarms at locations like this because of what they can reveal about stress transfer and interaction between larger, more consequential fault systems nearby. A swarm concentrated at a junction connecting multiple major tectonic boundaries doesn't necessarily indicate that a major earthquake on Cascadia or the Queen Charlotte Fault is imminent, but it does provide scientists with valuable, real-time data about how stress is currently moving through this genuinely complicated corner of the Pacific Plate boundary system. Data that feeds directly into the broader models researchers use to understand seismic hazard across the entire region. It's genuinely important to be clear and honest about what this current swarm does and doesn't tell us. Nothing about this sequence of earthquakes, even including the magnitude 5.6 event on August 1st, indicates that a major Cascadia megathrust earthquake or a significant Queen Charlotte Fault rupture is about to occur. Earthquake swarms at triple junctions, like this one, are a documented recurring feature of this specific location's tectonic behavior, not a novel or unprecedented development. The 2024 swarm at this same location, which included a considerably larger magnitude 6, 4 main shock, along with more than a dozen additional magnitude 4+ events, ultimately produced no damage, no injuries, and no tsunami, resolving without escalating into anything more significant. That historical precedent is genuinely relevant context for understanding the current sequence, and it's a big part of why officials aren't treating this as an emergency situation requiring public alerts or evacuation guidance. That said, the reason this swarm still deserves genuine attention and the reason we're covering it today comes down to what it represents about the broader seismic reality facing British Columbia's coast. This is a province, and specifically a stretch of coastline, that Earthquakes Canada and International Seismic Hazard Assessments consistently rank among the highest earthquake risk zones in the entire country. Vancouver Island and coastal British Columbia sit at the convergence of offshore plate boundaries, active crustal faults, and the looming, rare but catastrophic threat of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, placing major population centers, critical infrastructure including ports, bridges, hospitals, and schools, and essential lifeline systems for the greater Vancouver region, within one of Canada's most significant seismic hazard zones. When a swarm like this one activates at a genuinely complex tectonic junction connected to these larger systems, it's a meaningful reminder, even absent any indication of imminent danger, that this coastline sits in a fundamentally active, ongoing tectonic environment, one capable of producing earthquakes ranging from these currently unfelt offshore swarms all the way up to the kind of magnitude 8 and magnitude 9 events documented in the region's geological and historical record. For residents across Vancouver Island and coastal British Columbia more broadly, the practical takeaway from this swarm mirrors the standard, well-established earthquake preparedness guidance that Earthquakes Canada and provincial emergency management agencies have promoted for years, guidance that remains just as relevant regardless of whether any specific swarm ultimately amounts to anything more significant. Having a household emergency plan, knowing how to secure heavy furniture and water heaters, keeping a basic emergency kit stocked with several days of food, water, and essential supplies, and understanding your community's tsunami evacuation routes, if you live in a low-lying coastal area, remain genuinely sound practices given the well-documented seismic hazard this entire region faces, independent of any single earthquake swarm currently making headlines. For anyone specifically interested in tracking this ongoing activity, Earthquakes Canada maintains public, real-time earthquake monitoring specifically for this purpose, allowing residents to follow developments directly from the same official source scientists themselves rely on, rather than through secondhand reports. It's also worth understanding, as a broader point about how seismology actually works in a region this tectonically active, why swarms like this one keep recurring at the exact same location over multiple years, rather than earthquake activity being spread randomly and unpredictably across the entire coastline. The underlying physical structure at this specific triple junction, the ongoing spreading at the Juan de Fuca Ridge, the persistent transform motion along the Sovanco fracture zone, and the active deformation of the small explorer plate against its neighbors along the Nootka Fault doesn't change from year to year. These are permanent, ongoing geological processes, meaning the underlying mechanism generating stress at this location remains constantly active, occasionally releasing that stress through exactly the kind of earthquake swarms we've now seen recur at essentially the same coordinates in both 2024 and again this year. That consistency is actually useful information for the scientists studying this junction, because it means every new swarm adds to an increasingly detailed long-term data set about precisely how this particular corner of the Pacific Plate boundary system behaves over time, data that ultimately feeds into broader hazard models for the entire British Columbia coast, including the far more consequential Cascadia and Queen Charlotte fault systems this junction connects to. So where does this leave things right now? The current swarm remains active as of the most recent recorded events, with the magnitude 5.6 earthquake on August 1st standing as the largest event in this specific sequence so far, though smaller earthquakes have continued being recorded in the following days across British Columbia's broader seismic network. No tsunami warnings have been issued in connection with this swarm, and no damage or injuries have been reported, consistent with the pattern established by the nearly identical 2024 sequence at this same location. Earthquakes Canada continues monitoring the situation as part of its routine, ongoing seismic surveillance of this genuinely active stretch of the Pacific coast. We'll keep tracking this earthquake swarm as it continues to develop, along with any broader seismic activity across British Columbia's coastal fault systems in the weeks ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss those updates, and if you live anywhere along Vancouver Island or coastal British Columbia, this is a good moment to review your own household's earthquake preparedness and familiarize yourself with your community's tsunami evacuation routes if you're in a low-lying coastal area. Drop a comment letting me know if you've felt any of these earthquakes yourself, or if you live in a region that regularly deals with seismic activity like this. Stay curious, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next one.